Good afternoon, everyone. From our side in South Africa, it's afternoon midday. Welcome to this online panel discussion. It's an honor to have you all online here as well. Allow me to extend a warm word of welcome to this online panel hosted by Scientia Militaria, South African Journal of Military Studies. Scientia Militaria encourages a debate on defense, security, and military affairs. And to our guests, Professor Hussein, Dr. Sergey Kostelyanets, and Dr. Benjamin Mokoena, to Mr. Jordan, to my left-hand side. The moderator for today will shortly introduce formally. A special word of welcome. Allow me to also acknowledge the members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the SANDF, members of the South African Association for Political Studies, and other contributors to the book. First of all, congratulations to the editors, Dr. Sergey Kostelyanets and Professor Hussein, as well as Dr. Benjamin Mokoena, and the authors of the book, on the recently published book, on this important peer review article, Between Promise and Peril, South African Security in the 21st Century. This book is a result of the International Scientific Conference held in June last year on the same title. And I do hope that this discussion will resonate and evoke a sense of appreciation towards the complex environment of insecurity in Africa, exacerbated by conflict matters, revealing a change from traditional wars between major insurgent movements and government armies to violence among diverse non-state actors like tribal militias and criminal groups. Between Promise and Peril, African security in the 21st century should be regarded as a compendium of knowledge focusing on Africa's security, its landscape, its perils and challenges. While various authors provided invaluable insight into the different dimensions of African security in the 21st century, it is worth mentioning the contribution of our panelists today. Dr. Kostelyanets delves into the escalating military presence of foreign powers in Africa, highlighting the intensifying competition for political and economic influence, despite positive expectations for Africa's independent agenda. Professor Hussein addresses Africa's counterinsurgency challenges, noting an increase in terrorist incidents on the continent despite subnational training and access to equipment. Dr. Mokoena delves into state fragility in Kenya, defining it as underperformance and improper governance at multiple levels. May I ask you to kindly switch off your cameras and mute your microphones to allow a smooth flow of discussions. Nevertheless, please feel free to post your questions online to the panel and the panel members. Please enjoy this discussion. I'll hand over to Mr. Jordan now as the moderator for this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reutner. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to add to what Dr. Reutner said. This book provides a variety of contextual and specific themes on African security, and this open access book is available on the wide website of the Institute for African Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences. The link to the book will be available in the chat function of our online meeting, so you're welcome to click on that to download the book, and thank you for that accessibility. Kindly note that this panel discussion will be recorded and it will also be broadcasted live on YouTube. Also, please note that the views raised in this discussion are not necessarily that of Scientia Militaria or any other organization. It will be the views of the individual participants. I will first provide just a quick overview of our program, and then I will just cover the curriculum vitae of speakers today. So we will start off with Professor Hussein, who will provide an overview of the book and his chapter. And then Dr. Sergey Kostelyanets will give an overview of his chapter. and also provide some concluding insights regarding the book. And then Dr. Mokoena will discuss his chapter. After that, we will have a question and answer session, and then we'll do the closing remarks. So I'll just introduce our speakers. Professor Hussein Solomon holds a doctorate in political science from the University of South Africa. Currently, he is the senior professor in the Center for Gender and Africa Studies at the University of the Free State. His previous appointments include being senior professor in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of the Free State. He was also professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria. He was also executive director of the International Institute of Islamic Studies from 2009 to 2010. Currently, he is visiting fellow at the Mokoena program for the study of long-wave events at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the United Kingdom. Currently, he is a visiting professor at Osaka University and a senior research associate of the Jerusalem-based think tank Research on Islam and Muslims in Africa. Dr. Sergey Kostelyanets is head of the Center for Sociological and Political Studies at the Institute for African Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He is also an associate professor at People's Friendship University of Russia and senior research fellow at the National Research University, also known as Higher School of Economics. His research interests include armed conflicts and conflict resolution in Africa, terrorism, secessionist movements, and relations between Russia, non-African Muslim countries in Africa. Dr. Kostelyanets has published the book Darfur, The History of the Conflict, and over 100 research papers in academic journals and anthologies. Dr. Kostelyanets worked previously at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in the sections for human rights and for combating human trafficking. Dr. Benjamin Mokoena, who is sitting with us here, is an alumnus of Stellenbosch University and the University of the Free State, the African Center for Strategic Studies, and the Arnold A. Zaltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies in the USA. His research focus is security studies, namely African security, foreign policy, violent extremism, terrorism, insurgency, good governance, theory building and theory testing, and his teaching areas include African security, geopolitics, foreign policy, and the military instrument, international political economy, and political theory. I will now hand over to Professor Hussein Solomon, who will provide us an overview of the book and some more insights on this chapter that he wrote. Professor Solomon, thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thanks so much for the journal Scientia Militaria for doing this book launch. And specifically, I would like to thank Professor Kleinhans, Dr. Retener, Dr. Evert Jordan, and Annelie Delport for organizing this event. And I should say that I have a long association with the military academy, and I hope this strengthens with time going by. I apologize for my voice. I had a sudden flu which started this morning. So the book stems from an MOU between the Institute for Africa Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences and the University of the Free State. It's the second book we've done together, and it emanates from the joint conference we had. I should maybe say to you that initially my attempt at an MOU with the Russian Academy of Sciences was purely to get free vodka from the Russians, but then I suddenly realized I'm Muslim and that's not going to help. But on a more serious note, I really want to thank my co-editor, Dr. Sergey Kostelyanets, without whom this would have not been possible. Sergey, you're a superb scholar, a wonderful colleague, and a dear friend. I think the collaboration with my colleagues in Moscow and Banja Luka was a steep learning curve. I think it is great to collaborate with people who emanate from different intellectual traditions, thereby enriching the academic experience. So as you heard, I'm going to be focusing on providing an overview of the book as well as my chapter. So So the book starts with the 2015 AU Agenda 2063, which had its goal of silencing the guns by 2020. Clearly, this was not achieved. And the violence uh, uh, goes to undermine other AU goals like socioeconomic development through damage to infrastructure, migration, undermining creating inclusive societies, and of course, exacerbating state fragility. So the nature of conflict has been changing. This is not the 60s, the conflicts between the 60s and the 90s. For example, between Frelimo and Renamo, or the MPLA and UNITA. Okay, what you have is a myriad of non-state actors, from tribal militias, criminal organizations, homegrown Islamist movements linking up with international terrorist networks, a new scramble for Africa's resources on the part of a number of traditional and new external actors. You have rivalries between external actors also spilling over onto African soil. And the book brings together academics from different institutions, and it attempts to provide a wide-angle lens of the African security landscape, covering such diverse topics as the geopolitical context, global military competition, counterinsurgency in Africa, the security crisis in Burkina Faso, the economic dimensions of warfare and insurgencies in West and Central Africa, hybrid warfare, the specter of nuclear terror in Africa, energy security and geopolitics, state building in Somaliland, state fragility and violent extremism in Kenya, and international media and security in Africa. As the editor, Sergey and I did not attempt to prescribe a theory or approach to the respective authors. This way, readers are exposed to a plurality of different views, thereby enriching the intellectual experience. Uh, and I think while the book is about security, we also need to understand that there's a lot going for Africa. I mean, this is not a poor continent. So there's peril from insecurity, but there's also the promise of a better tomorrow. I mean, Africa produces 60% of the world's gold output, 77% of its diamonds, 17% of its copper, ore, and bauxite, 26% of its coal, large amounts of phosphate, cobalt, tungsten, and other ores. Africa needs to realize its economic potential, practicing good governance, ensuring its education systems are up to scratch, and ensuring that the wealth of Africa benefits its people, not political elites, and definitely not foreign actors. Africa needs to realize its own agency and set the agenda in the relationship with external parties. And there's also a tremendous need for greater coherence amongst Africans. Africa's development prospects are, of course, constrained by its energy constraints. As such, some authors feel that there's a pressing need to seriously think about nuclear energy. Uh, Africa's security deficit is, of course, undermining its economic development. In the case of Burkina Faso, there's only one gendarme for 1,800 people, as opposed to the international norm of one for every 400 people. Because the intervention of external forces is not always altruistic, there's a desperate need for foreign military presence to be minimized while Africans develop their own national, regional, and continental security mechanisms. I frankly don't think, and this is a personal view, that the current African security architecture is actually working. So given the religious and ethnic fissures within society, religious leaders and clan elders should not be forgotten when discussing security mechanisms. Basic conflict resolution and mediation structures already exist within religious communities and clans, and these need to be strengthened and connected with an overarching national framework for the creation of a harmonious society. But even if is in place, the authors in this volume show how Boko Haram and Islamic State in West Africa province, for instance, in the Lake Chad Basin, are instrumentalizing ethnic and religious differences in order to engage in illicit economic activities. So this needs to be stopped. Then there's the portrayal of African conflicts in foreign media. which often does not represent the realities on the ground. And there is a need for African media to be strengthened, for the African narrative to be put out there, and so forth. And that, of course, is also a resource problem. So, having provided an overview of the book, let me take my last few minutes uh, to give you some insight about my chapter called Getting Counterinsurgency Right in Africa. And I think that there are 7 lessons that we can talk about. I think counterinsurgency fails when the wrong people are recruited and deployed, when people are appointed on the basis of who they know as opposed to what they know. Uh, Counterinsurgency fails when the insurgents are not just out there, but within your ranks. And this has been a recurring problem. Counterinsurgency fails when rank and file soldiers are not looked after. In Nigeria, for example, the Nigerian soldiers fighting the insurgency in the north suddenly found that they were not getting their daily allowance and their food rations miraculously dried up because of corruption in the military. Counterinsurgency fails when insurgents deploy superior tactics than those of the state. I mean, AMISOM was established to defeat al-Shabaab in 2007. 16 years later, al-Shabaab is still around, in my view, because of its superior tactics and using groups of 15 to 20 fighters armed with IEDs. I think counterinsurgency operations fail when they are not intelligence driven. Political mandarins often do not provide sufficient funding to engage in long-term intelligence operations to penetrate Islamist organizations, and they suffer as a result. Counterinsurgency also fails when it ignores history and context, and are then often blindsided when Islamist insurgents whom they have defeated resurface in another form years later, as has been the case with Boko Haram. To give you one example, on the historical side, consider the calls for an independent homeland for the Tuaregs, the so-called Azawad, which goes back to 28 December 1893, when French troops entered Timbuktu and declared it as a French possession. Islamists, of course, capitalized on this national struggle for independence. So there's a need to separate ethnic nationalists in the insurgents from more hard-nosed religious fundamentalists. So on that brief note, I just want to thank you once again for hosting us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Solomon. I will now give an opportunity for Dr. Sergey Kostelyanets to give us an overview of his chapter and some concluding thoughts, please.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the launch of the book, Between Promise and Peril, African Security in the 21st Century. I sincerely hope that everyone will find something useful in this book, which, by the way, as has been mentioned, has been put online just last week for free download, just as our previous joint publication on terrorism. So they're all available from our website. First, I cannot but return my sincere thanks to Professor Solomon and his colleagues from the UFS, from Stellenbosch, who made a crucial contribution to this book. It's my strong belief that discussions on Africa would be incomplete without an input by Africans themselves, especially South Africans, who undoubtedly lead on the African continent in the fields of political science, international relations, security studies, and other related areas. Suffice to look at the Scopus list of top-ranked African scholarly journals in social sciences. Well, 10 out of top 10 are South African. In this connection, I'm grateful for the organization of this book launch by the South African Journal of Military Studies, which is one of such renowned and authoritative academic journals. Second, my thanks go to our colleagues from Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina, who have contributed 3 chapters. Our cooperation with the independent University of Banja Luka hasn't been as long as with the UFS, but indeed very fruitful. They provided an important alternative view on the place of Africa in the global arena. Last but not least, I want to thank my Russian colleagues at the Institute for African Studies, who continue to heed my calls for papers. Without intellectual input and hard work, there wouldn't have been this book. I will now say a few words about the contents of the book. I shall agree with the words by my dear friend Professor Solomon about the need for greater coherence, for greater coordination among Africans. In fact, I believe that all chapters in our book, despite its authors coming from such different backgrounds, they possess the spirit of respect for Africa's own agency. We all know how hard it is for African states to refuse conditional aid from wealthy countries, including some former colonial powers. But I believe that the realization that Africa should stop acting as a beggar, and it has come to dominate at least academic circles. Indeed, there is still immense amount of fragility, of division, inequality, but with every year there is more and more coordination in Africa, including in the sphere of security. A recent step in this direction has been the joining of G20 by the EU. So this is yet another opportunity for Africans to speak with one voice and, more importantly, act with one agenda in the world. So hopefully we shall also see one day a representative of Africa among the permanent members of the UN Security Council. But indeed, there are many challenges for Africa along this road. A sharp increase in geopolitical tensions following the start of Russia's military operation in Ukraine and the introduction of unprecedented Western sanctions against Moscow, including the blanket freezing of dower assets. It has resonated across the planet. And the continent is no exception in this regard. The global geopolitical fight for Africa has only been intensifying, and it undermines the sovereignty of African states and escalates the risks of political and military destabilization, including unconstitutional takeovers of power. One cannot also discount the looming fourth technological revolution and energy transition, which may in fact be the underlying causes of many symptoms of instability. Under the circumstances, all threats to African countries have intensified and the new ones have emerged, shaped by complex interplay of local, international factors, economic factors. So if left unchecked, these threats may undermine Africa's economic progress, have a knock-on effect on the continental integration agenda. So clearly we live in an eye-for-eye world, and Africa also should not turn the other cheek when its interests are at stake. So that's it's vital that the scope of our book covers both traditional and new for Africa security-related issues such as peacekeeping, counterinsurgency, foreign military presence, hybrid warfare, nuclear terrorism, peaceful atom, state fragility, and neo-patrimonialism. A grave peril is that Africa may once again become a proxy battlefield for conflicts between great and regional non-African powers. So in the book we have paid special attention to the dynamics between local and foreign factors of destabilization in African countries. A particular focus has been made on the dilemma of state building and its impact on African security. One of the overarching narratives has been that Africa's security is no longer a regional issue, but a global one, as the geopolitical and geoeconomic significance of the continent has increased dramatically. So Professor Solomon gave an excellent overview of specific key conclusions. I shall stop at just a few aspects. I will say a few words about my own chapter, but actually I wanted to start with a different part of the book. Unfortunately, our format didn't allow its authors to speak as key presenters. So in particular, I believe that the book presents a valuable discussion on hybrid threats that Africa faces. This discussion has been conducted by 2 Bosnian and 1 Russian contributor. The authors discuss the typology of hybrid wars and then put this typology in the African context. Unfortunately, very few countries in Africa are prepared for hybrid attacks, when non-traditional instruments of war hold very high operational value. Even though hybrid warfare is not new for the continent, with Libya in 2011 being the prime example. The book, for instance, identifies African countries that belong to the hybrid attack risk group, according to several criteria, including proximity to Russia and also China, refusal to participate in anti-Russian sanctions, strategic importance, the presence of weak points to which any of the hybrid levers may be applied. The highest risk groups include Egypt, Algeria, the Central African Republic, Mali, but also South Africa. While in the Sahel and Central Africa, the hybrid war is already ongoing and involves the military component in the face of various shades of extremists, separatists. The 2 North African countries and South Africa are the potential future targets of a regime change strategy that employs hybrid warfare elements. Yet these countries are sore in Western attempts to isolate Russia and ultimately contain China. Egypt and Algeria are Russia's top trading partners in Africa, primarily in the field of military technical cooperation, while South Africa is a major political partner, one of the founders of the BRICS alliance. The latter has come to forefront as an alternative to Western-dominated blocs and organizations. As Egypt and Ethiopia are set to join BRICS starting next year, Algeria in all likelihood in 2025, Nigeria, according to its foreign minister, by 2026, the alliance will, in the foreseeable future, embrace almost politically, economically, and militarily powerful countries in Africa, which is another worrying development for the West. South Africa, in particular, poses a relatively soft target for hybrid attacks given the economic difficulties, high unemployment, poor image of the government, which all may facilitate mass protest of the population. At the same time, South Africa's adherence to non-alignment, to its position on Russia-Ukraine conflict, more recently on the Israeli military operation in Gaza, puts it at odds with its Western alliance. Admittedly, as of today, there exists no violent anti-government entity in South Africa that may constitute a non-traditional internal actor in a hybrid attack on the country. However, one should recall the history of domestic violence in South Africa, for example, the urban wars between the Zulu and Xhosa in the 1990s, the 2021 events related to the arrest of former President Zuma, to see how much destructive potential there exists in the country. At the same time, it may be argued that the information war against South Africa has already started. The accusations by US officials that South Africa sold weapons to Russia last year, which were quickly disseminated and perpetuated by the international mass media, are just one such example. So are we seeing a prologue of a hybrid attack or just a case of diplomatic pressure? Well, it's still arguable, but the threat is there, no doubt. Anyway, more details are in the book. I definitely wish all our South African friends peaceful and fair election next year and hope that these threats do not materialize. So this was just one of the topics of the book. Now, in my own chapter, I explored the global military competition for Africa under the guise of fighting terrorism and humanitarian considerations. Foreign military presence in Africa has increased exponentially since the start of the war on terror. As of 2023, Russia is actually the only permanent member of the UN Security Council, which doesn't have a permanent military presence in Africa, well, even though there is some certain presence in Africa. Despite the increased foreign military presence and assistance, jihadist attacks have grown stronger. Government forces in many regions have been on the back foot, well, especially in the Sahel, of course. So in my opinion, for Africa to embrace the promise of a better tomorrow, foreign military influence on the continent has to be minimized, and Africans have to develop and strengthen their own national, regional, and continental security mechanisms. And I do believe actually that there are some promises, tendencies on the continent in this regard, some more integration agenda and coordination mechanisms. This was my own chapter. I don't really want to add more spoilers. I should also know that the security dynamic in Africa is changing fast and calls for continued research in this regard. So this year we have witnessed the transformation of conflicts in the Sahel, the formation of the alliance of Sahel states. We have seen a major conflict erupt in Sudan, there is still ambiguous repercussions for the region, but if Sudan follows the Libyan scenario, the repercussions will be very grave. So we will see much violence in the east of the DRC, chronic instability in Nigeria, military coups, and electoral violence in multiple regions. So unfortunately, there's ripe material for analysis at the future stages of our collaboration, which I'm looking forward to. So thank you very much all for coming, for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kostelyanets. I will now give an opportunity to Dr. Benjamin Mokoena to talk to us about his chapter. Benjamin?
Thanks. Good afternoon, colleagues. Firstly, I would like to thank the two editors for organizing the conference last year and the book. And of course, also say thank you to the fellow contributors who have contributed different chapters to the book. But I will, dive directly to my own chapter. So when one speaks about African security, I suppose one can have, as we have already had, look at different themes and different approaches, different concerns. And my concern or my approach with the chapter was to look at the causes of the security challenges that we're facing, and of course, how do we counter or resolve these security challenges? So I looked at a specific security challenge, which is, of course, Islamist violent extremism, to say why has it been so difficult for different governments to mediate or counter this security threat. And I look specifically at the case of Kenya. One can, of course, would have looked at Mozambique or Nigeria or any other context in the Sahel region, for example. But then looking at the case of Kenya, I look at, for example, the specific case of Al-Shabaab. It was established in 2006. The first terrorist attack or incident that it had in Kenya is 2008. And we know AMISOM has been deployed against them since 2007. Now this is 2023. Why is it so difficult for governments to deal with this security challenge? And I ascribe this to specific impediments, or one would call them barriers or obstacles. And I'll come back to that just now. But perhaps I should then take a step back to say, but what type of challenge is this that we are facing? Now, Islamist violent extremism, of course, or Islamism is a movement, is an ideology, whether it's global, international movement, ideology, and there's, of course, specific organizations. And these organizations, of course, have a specific objective. And the main objective, of course, is to establish Islamic states. Now, in trying to achieve this main objective, of course, they engage in different campaigns. And one of them, of course, is a terrorist campaign. Another one, like you find in the case of Kenya. Another campaign that they engage in, of course, is insurgency that you would find in the cases of Mali, Nigeria, or the case of Somalia. And then, of course, the other one is to establish proto-states, that would eventually form these Islamic states that they would want to achieve. Now, the question is, why is it then so difficult for the global community and specific governments to counter the security threats? And like I said, then my approach was to look at what I believe is specific obstacles, specific impediments that governments face when they are dealing with such security challenge. And there are two specific, if you will, impediments, general impediments and what I believe is specific impediments. Now, when it comes to general impediments, one of the impediments that countering Islamist violent extremism is faced with, including counterterrorism is faced with, is the case of the utility of force. We know it's very difficult to utilize force in such context, whether because you using force against people, against an ideology, and we see how difficult, and the history of counterterrorism shows this, demonstrates this to us, how difficult that is, and we see it taking place in the case of Gaza now, as we are speaking, how difficult it is to bring force to bear. And whether that achieves any positive outcomes, when you bring in this force to bear against people and against an ideology. But what I then look at specifically in the chapter and in the context of Kenya is these specific impediments. And I say these impediments then can be found, the source of these impediments can be found at different spaces, or what one perhaps would call different environments. And I identify 5 of these environments, the geographical and physical spaces, and what I call cohesion spaces, political and legal spaces, social spaces, and then the 5th one is external spaces, or the region that Kenya finds itself. Now, I will not go into, because of time, into the details of the specific impediments that one finds in these different spaces. But perhaps I can look at one of the spaces and identify it as example and highlight specific impediments or barriers, obstacles that come from this space. So the fifth space that these impediments come from is the external space, external to Kenya. So what I mean by that, of course, is the region that Kenya finds itself in. Now Kenya finds itself in a region where it is surrounded by a variety of fragile states. And each of them pose security challenges to Kenya itself. And one of them is Somalia. The reason why there is terrorist attacks over the border into Kenya is exactly that, because Somalia next to them is unable to maintain its security. It's unable to deal with the case of Al-Shabaab. But of course, there's also other reasons. Is the Horn of Africa, of course, is connected to the Arabian Peninsula. Now, Islamist violent extremism as an ideology, as a movement with organizations, you find that there is cooperation between the different organizations. Now, there's linkages, of course, between Al-Shabaab in Akab, the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is based in Yemen. So what I then say is, as long as there is fragility in Somalia, as long as there is a forever war in Somalia, as long as there's these linkages between Al-Shabaab and other Islamist organizations outside of Kenya, these and various other obstacles will hamper whatever efforts at countering Islamist violent extremism in Kenya itself. So the biggest obstacle, or one of the biggest obstacles, then in countering Islamist violent extremism or countering terrorism in Kenya is this region that Kenya then finds itself. Now, Al-Shabaab itself, of course, is not a security threat to Kenya itself. It is a security threat to Somalia. It is a security threat to the East African region. But at this stage, there is no East African response to Al-Shabaab. So as long as there's this war, this challenge faced by both Al-Shabaab and no, not Al-Shabaab, faced by both Kenya and Somalia in the region, and there's no regional response, I believe that it would be very difficult for Kenya itself on its own to deal with Al-Shabaab as a security challenge. And one, of course, can also perhaps look at other spaces to identify these impediments. One of them, of course, that we can look at, what I've mentioned, is the political space or the political environment. At this stage, there is a specific cognitive barrier or impediment in the case of the Kenyan government in the sense of how they perceive Al-Shabaab. Now, this is, of course, convenient for the Kenyan government to perceive Al-Shabaab and see Al-Shabaab as merely a terrorist criminal organization. And that's how they deal with it. And that's what informs their counterterrorism architecture. Now, like I said, that is convenient, but it is not always helpful, because Al-Shabaab are not merely terrorist, extremist criminals. These are political actors. Now, yes, they engage in violent politics. They do not engage merely in persuasion politics, but they are, in essence, political actors. Now, up until such time that the Kenyan government and many other governments start to look at these organizations as political actors, they are political actors that have political objectives, that have constituencies that support them. That cognitive barrier will always hamper whatever efforts that these organizations are perceived to be. But like I said, those are the 5 environments that, or spaces, that I classify where these sources or these impediments to countering this security challenge emanate from. So at this, and then that's what the chapter is then about. And I then conclude that as long as these impediments remain, it would be very difficult for Kenya to resolve the security issue of Al-Shabaab. And perhaps that's where I should leave it for now. In the Q&A, perhaps we can then go, if there's specific questions, into the specific impediments that I did not cover now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mokoena. We will open the floor now for 2 questions from the online audience. We have a number of questions on the chat, which we will come back to later, but let's just take 2 questions from the audience now, please. If you will, you can direct your question at one of the panel members. So the floor is open for questions. Okay, otherwise I'll start with one of the questions from the chat box. The question one that was asked here is, the media is regarded as the fulcrum of democracy, but it belongs to business and they are driven by self-interest. How can a more objective reporting be ensured? Does any of the panel members maybe want to take that question on the media?
Well, if I could possibly, I did kind of respond to the question by stating that one of the challenges that African media has is the fact that they're resource poor. They don't have the money to send a journalist to Mali or to Somalia or anywhere like that. So they rely upon reports from Reuters, which they then simply reprint. So the problem is that an African audience finds out about an African conflict through the media lens of these particular Western interests or whatever, whoever has the more resources to put down journalists and so on. And I also think that our journalists, frankly, when I look at some of the stories, they need to be sensitized towards more nuanced, more in-depth analysis, and just rather than just simply go for the soundbite. So there's a need for a better training in that. I mean, there was a time you would recall when you would have a financial journalist separate from a political journalist, separate from, let's say, uh, someone commenting about entertainment news. Now you find these journalists operating in these different environments because it's cheaper and they need to be a jack of all trades, but there's very, very little specialist skills there. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Maybe just to follow up on that, Professor Solomon, do you think the proactiveness of governments and how they respond to specific issues by using the media instead of being reactive, does that maybe play a role for how African governments can maybe deal with agenda setting better on these security challenges?
Well, on the one hand, there's all of these foreign interests, but on the other hand, let's also be frank, you also have African governments who don't want to have a critical media. That's the reality. And so they don't have an interest in terms of developing the media, as an alternative portrayal. I remember during the Thabo Mbeki years and African Renaissance and so on, there was a very conscious effort in terms of at least the South African media not to tailor make their narrative for the political project set out by Mbeki, but they were very sensitive around this, and now they seem to have gotten much lazier and doing desktop research and so on. So there's so you have a situation where these things come together, and the people who suffer the most, of course, is ordinary citizens who don't get a nuanced a view of a conflict. It's seen in black and white terms, as opposed to seeing different shades of gray and mediating through this and trying to understand or the interests involved and so on. Uh, and I think that's problematic when that media then reinforces certain decisions by policymakers. That also becomes problematic. Thank you.
Thank you. Marcel, do you maybe want to mention your comment?
Thank you. I just it's a broad comment. When I read the book and all the chapters, the context as you've all highlighted is solidified in terrorism, but still opportunity. I just have a comment, and it's based maybe from personal bias, and that's the question of maybe strengthening traditional intelligence practices and human intelligence and within the military environments, upping training in intelligence tradecraft and linking it to new technologies and new developments, because we are moving in a specific direction, maybe just to combat terrorism and terrorist activities. But that's a nuanced area anyway. But just a comment from my side.
Any other questions from the floor of the audience?
Can I quickly respond to Dr. Reitner's point, if that's possible?
Please, Professor.
Yes.
Look, a few months ago, I did a presentation to Defense Intelligence, and they used me because they wanted an academic perspective, a different perspective, if you wish, and so on. And it was specifically about the Russian-Ukraine conflict. But I think there's a need. In your previous book launch, it was General Ibn Barlow's book about the use of human intelligence in composite warfare. And I think it's absolutely imperative to deepen your human intelligence and so on. But I think what you're doing now in terms of this book launch, in terms of the journal that you all are having, the fact that you all are kind of insiders, outsiders, that you're part of the military academy, but you're also part of academia. I think what needs to happen, and I'm specifically talking about the SANDF here, is that strengthening these ties between academia and state structures, between academia and NGOs. I mean, I think of the good work, for example, being done by ISS, by Accord, and these kinds of individuals. And then, I mean, of course, the political mandarins may not agree with the analysis and so on, but it allows them an opportunity to think outside the box. And then having these relationships, I think, is fantastic. But I don't know, Sergey, maybe you want to come in about the Russian experience.
If we're speaking about Russian experience in human intelligence, well, I think it's, of course, there's a lot of experience in any kinds of intelligence and with conflicts, especially maybe in Chechnya and Ukraine now. In Africa, of course, it's a difficult terrain for us in this regard, I think, and for maybe in terms of intelligence, artificial intelligence, which is also coming to this sector. But I think that now this will be a more important point for us increasingly, given the various latest developments. But in the current book, I don't think we have much about this. But I think in the future we will need to pay more attention about this. But I don't think that there's certain specific conclusions that Russia could contribute to in this regard. But I think you should expect more from us in this regard in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Thank you, Marcus. I'll take you on to speak, man.
Hello. Sorry. Vesna Rolic from Republic of Srpska, Bosnia and Herzegovina, ex-Yugoslav Republic. And I have maybe one comment about media, because this problem is almost problem for 30 years. I don't believe that the African states, even Russia and all ex-Eastern Bloc states, don't use enough media power to win in these hybrid wars. They constantly lose media wars. I believe this problem has to be solved very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe a response from one of the panel members?
So to be frank, maybe if you could put it in writing, I didn't hear some parts of that. For example, I don't know if my colleague did hear more, but there were some interruptions, honestly, on this side.
Okay. Ma'am, if you can please just put it in the chat box, we will get to your question, your comment. Thank you. Benjamin, I think there was a question directed to your direction. I'm going to read it to you. It uses the abbreviation TOC. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with, I think it refers to secured funding, but I'll read the question to you. Did you look at the interrelationship between TOC seemingly used as intelligence assets on terrorist networks? That's the question. And then it goes on. It says, all terrorist networks seem to be aware of this interrelationship between the securitization apparatus and the TOC receiving protection. This appears to have contributed to the increase of TOC and terrorism. Are there other approaches that can be used?
Well, if the person that asked the question can please explain TOC, we use a lot of these abbreviations. I have no idea what TOC means. It would be helpful, please.
I believe he's talking about transnational organized crime.
Okay.
Oh, okay. If that's the case, there's always, many of these non-state actors. There's always cooperation between or interaction, if you will, not necessarily cooperation, but interaction between terrorist organizations and many other non-state actors, whether it's business or it is criminal organizations, etc. And when one can find this, examples of this, whether you're talking about Boko Haram, using kidnapping for ransom to get funding, or in the specific case that I looked at in the case of Al-Shabaab, one of the reasons that Al-Shabaab has been able to sustain itself and remain resilient as they have been since 2006. You must understand, they've been classified as a terrorist organization since 2006. So there's a coalition of forces against them. The U.S., classified by various governments, all over the world, the U.S., the British, Saudi Arabia, etc., as a terrorist organization. Now, how have they been able to survive up until now? One of them, the reasons, of course, is they have engaged in what we could call illicit criminal activities, whether it was the sale of sugar, the sale of coal or charcoal. A 2006 report by the United Nations clearly demonstrates this, to the extent that they actually have collaborated with members of AMISOM and members of the Kenyan government or the military, including the public officials and members of the Somali military forces, in gaining from the illicit trade in charcoal and the sale of sugar, which is of course imported into Kenya. And these people, of course, are supposed to be fighting against each other, and that's one of the reasons why people say these conflicts take as long as they do, because they actually is no interest for many of these actors to resolve the conflict. Everyone is getting rich out of conflicts in Africa, and you see it of course in the case of the DRC as well. That's why the conflict has been going on since the 1990s, because the people are suffering on the ground, ordinary citizens, but there are people who are making money out of these conflicts, and it is in their interests to ensure that these conflicts take place. So these organizations, although they purport to be fighting a holy war, one would not expect them to engage with criminal organizations and engage in criminal activities, illicit trade, for example, but they do, because they are also very pragmatic in terms of how they get their funding. So their funding sources are very limited. And of course, one of them includes criminal activities, and one finds that they do interact with criminal organizations. So yes, that's the linkages.
Thank you, Benjamin. Any other questions from the audience?
Sorry, I noticed that there is that question posed in the chat function.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's the comment I think that we missed. African nations as well as Russia have been losing the media war for decades. The question is, what are the possible solutions given the decades-long media losses? And that was the question that we didn't catch in.
So if I take the question, maybe my colleagues will also supplement it, but as Russia has been mentioned, maybe I should start. So in fact, I would say that Russia realizes that it's losing the media war, and also on the African continent. So there is a strategy being developed for basically more investment in international media, in satellite channels, in radio stations, in other ways to, in various agreements with African media on joint publication. I think they just last week they signed a new agreement with Algeria or something. Like, so it's basically about RT, about Sputnik, about some other media outlets. So it's about a lot of money, of course, but basically you're paying for your information security, for your national security, if you're investing in your media. Of course, it should remain more or less objective, more or less independent, but they need a lot of infrastructure, they need equipment, they need various maybe benefits or tax exceptions and so on, from the exemptions from the government. So it's about national strategy. And for African nations, I think they've also come to this. I think North African nations have already realized this, and some sub-Saharan nations, and it will be more and more to be realized that if your media space is dominated by CNN and Bloomberg and so on, then probably you will also, your elites who are actually main consumers of this, they will also follow not the interests, maybe not the national interests, but the interests of this abstract international community or various interests that are pursued by the leading nations who control this media. So that's my 5 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kostelyanets. Dr. I have a question specifically for you, and I hope you can maybe shed some more light on this. One of the questions I picked up in the book is the rift between the West and Russia and the impact that this has on promoting peace and stability in Africa. Can you maybe tell us a bit more about that and give your insights on that, please?
I'm sorry, was it for me? I just lost
Yes.
it. Okay, and could you just give me the first sentence? Repeat the first sentence.
What is the impact of the rift between the West and Russia on promoting peace and stability in Africa? Can you maybe elaborate on that, please?
Well, for Africa, I think if we talk about the African perspective, there is, so this coin has two sides. On the one hand, of course, there is some more risks, more pressure, more instability. On the other hand, they get to choose at some point. Yes, in some situations they have more bidders, and so they can play on these differences and tensions between Russia and the West. But obviously only strong governments can play on these issues. Like Egypt, maybe like some other key nations, they can play one hand against the other. They can get some benefits. They can get money from American Congress. They can simultaneously get nuclear power stations from Russia. This is something that only a few African nations can get in this situation. Many others will probably be further destabilized by this situation unless they do something. For example, Sahelian states, they form in this alliance of states, like three states coming together to meet their security challenges. Well, this is some of the tendencies that may be a way to respond to the global geopolitical tensions. If they can do it one by one, they should do something together. But it's just one example. Of course, in Africa, you should probably focus more on Pan-African institutions, because these are something that should help African states protect their sovereignty. But unfortunately, as most of the funding of African Union still comes from the West, from Japan, from the West, from various other pro-Western sources of we can't speak about independent agenda of the African Union still. And so yes, it's good to get grants. It's good to accept money for development, for everything, but it shouldn't be conditional. At least it shouldn't be as conditional as it is now. It shouldn't be, so unless you start to pay more from the national budgets for the African Union, for African security architecture, you will not achieve what you, and you will not be the object of international, you will remain the object of international relations, not the subject. So the geopolitical tensions will continue to be more important for you than your national interests. So I think, but maybe my colleagues again will continue. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Reutner, you have a question.
Thank you very much. This question is for Dr. Popovich, actually. I'm just curious to find out, can there be a cultural interpretation of hybrid warfare in terms of East versus West, or rather, if I rephrase it, the interpretation of the use and purchase of nuclear capabilities for peaceful development, as opposed to the understanding of potential dangers in that context.
If I just may interrupt, I just said this is a question for Dr. Popovich, but because I presented some of this.
Okay.
Could you just explain, because we have very different parts of the book, one on nuclear terrorism, nuclear threats, nuclear possibilities, peaceful atom, and different one on hybrid operations. So how did you kind of draw this link between hybrid and nuclear? I didn't fully understand this.
Yeah, that's a valid response because I think it's chapter 7 dealing with the historical aspect and the historical context of nuclear warfare or nuclear specifically. My question is just, how do the East and West differ in terms of their perception on the utilization of nuclear on the African continent? One versus, from the one side, the peaceful use of nuclear technology versus the maybe interpretation of a so-called threat that's being developed.
Okay, well, Dr. Popovich, do you have something to say about this? I think I understand. Okay, well, you see, so first of all, you're right. This is the whole part is about hybrid and nuclear. It's just in one place. These are all things which we adopt as non-conventional, non-traditional threats for Africa, right? Now, in terms of East and West, so I'm not sure this is really so much covered in our book, this dilemma, this discourse about the differences. There's a lot about differences in terms of hybrid warfare, yes? Not so much about nuclear threat. That's the point. But in my take on this is that first of all, nuclear terrorism, I think it's unacceptable for anyone. I don't think there is any differences in terms of approach to this. Peaceful use of nuclear energy, well, it's probably more acceptable in terms of in Russia, for example, it's one of the main export kind of commodities actually, the construction of nuclear power plants. So definitely we have a very positive approach to this. But maybe it's more interesting to speak about East and West in terms of hybrid warfare. There's really much more differences in this part, not so much in terms of nuclear aspects of anything, because in this kind of discussion, obviously both sides are accusing the other of waging a war for nuclear. I'm sorry, not nuclear, not yet, hybrid warfare, and the definitions, yes, really differ kind of, because for the West, the main component of hybrid warfare would be this kind of unmarked, ununiformed units which would perform certain activities. So, for example, like Wagner or something in Ukraine or something in Libya. And for Russia, this main things that has to be like focused on in terms of hybrid warfare are information wars, attacks on terms of various sanctions, and maybe the links between Western governments and various extremist groups, which I think we have this kind of history in Afghanistan, when obviously Mujahids were helped by the CIA and then it went to Algeria and so on. So this really give much attention to links between extremists and terrorists and Islamists and various Western structures. So these are, I think, just various components of the same problem, that it's very expensive and very ineffective nowadays to wage a total war. So you employ various means to avoid a total war, and that you want proxies, you want very media outlets, you want various other instruments, non-traditional, unconventional instruments. Again, I don't really, maybe I won't really speak about nuclear in this regard so much, but in a way, of course, it's all new in terms of their influence on the international relations. I think that's the uniting theme in this part of the book. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think also, just to follow up very quickly, there were two chapters in the book on the nuclear issue. The one chapter spoke about the constraints for Africa's industrialization and economic development, and how nuclear energy could come in. The other chapter actually dealt with the possibility in terms of the downside of nuclear, the issue of terrorism and threats and so on. And that was done by Eamon Coetzee. And I think his conclusion was there is very minimal risk of that. Sorry, Dr. Popovic, sorry.
I think your microphone is off. Okay, I'm just going to, is there anybody that want to respond to that before we continue? Okay, Professor Solomon, I have another question for you. Mr. Solomon, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I have a question for you. In your chapter, you mentioned that there's been quite a number of external military training programs for African militaries, but we haven't really seen that their capacity building was sufficient for counterinsurgency. Can you maybe explain to us why you think this is the case, please?
Yeah, well, again, I want to go back to the last book launch which you did in terms of Eamon Barlow's book, where he pointed out, that African militaries have been trained by various foreign militaries, but you don't see the results. You don't see the results because the training is really not meant one for African conditions and so forth and so on. And I recently wrote a piece for this Jerusalem think tank, REMA, and I pointed out that in terms of West Africa, many of the graduates of Western military academies and training were responsible for coups across the Sahel region. Uh, and that's extremely problematic. But one of the chapters that we actually didn't discuss here, and I think was an important chapter, was by my colleague Albert Skuman, talking about the state itself, whether this Westphalian Weberian state actually is useful within the African context. Uh, Even in South Africa, we have seen, for example, Sergey mentioned the July 2021 riots. What we saw was local militia / vigilantes, private military, security groups, etc., rushing, and neighborhood watches and stuff, rushing to protect their malls and their houses and their businesses and so on. And we need to so the training that we give and so on is still assuming this sort of Western army, right? And on the ground, it's not like that. And so we need to also, I think, look at the kind of training that's being done. But very importantly, we need to problematize the state. Colonel Benjamin Mokoena argued very strongly about this issue of state fragility. And I think one of the reasons that the continental, regional, sub-regional structures of security is not working is because the Achilles heel is at the African level. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Benjamin, I actually have a question here specifically as a follow-on of that. Can you maybe explain to us or expand on how the constricted democratic space is an aggravating factor regarding state fragility?
Okay. Well, I use state fragility as a conceptual framework, a theoretical perspective to explain in this specific chapter these impediments to countering violent extremism. And one of the attributes or the properties of state fragility, state fragility has various attributes or properties, and one can classify them in terms of two themes. The first one is state fragility tends to be conflict generating. So fragile states tend to be abusive. For example, when it comes to countering violent extremism, they tend to be indiscriminate in their approach. And the case of Kenya is a classical example how the whole architecture of countering Islamist violent extremism is based on the Somalinization of that effort. So Somalis as an ethnic group are seen as the people who are mostly at risk, so who are most likely to be radicalized. And the second factor, of course, is that state fragility, in addition to being abusive, tends to limit the options that the state has. So it is linked then with limited state capacity. So it's limited state capacity plus being abusive. So there's very little options available for a fragile state. So a fragile state does not have the capacity, for example, the military forces to engage in counterterrorism or in counterinsurgency, for example. But what reduced options you find also in a fragile state is what the question then poses, is this constricted democratic space. Now, and that's the reason why many of these organizations, originate in the first place, because again, Kenya is a classical example. Now, what nature of the state or political culture do you find in Kenya? You find a political culture that is very intolerant of opposition, very intolerant of peaceful dissent. So you have an organization like Al-Shabaab, which has a constituency. Al-Shabaab purports to be representing ethnic Somali interests and Muslim interests. Now, Al-Shabaab is not the only Muslim formation in Kenya. There's various formations who are fighting for Islamic Muslim interests in Kenya. But of course, they don't engage in violent politics. They engage in persuasion politics. So they are trying to convince the Kenyan government to allow Muslims to have representation in Kenya, to say to the Kenyan government, listen, the areas that are most securitized in Kenya, that are most underdeveloped, are places where Muslims live. Muslims have not been given opportunities by the Kenyan government since independence. Of course, historically, this dates back to the Shifta War, where when independence occurred, we know that Eastern Kenya used to be part of Somalia. Now the British, of course, British colonialism partitioned that area and gave it to Kenya. Now, with independence of both states, Somalia and Kenya, the ethnic Somalis who stayed in Eastern Kenya wanted to be part of Somalia in the Shifta War. Now, since that civil war, there's this perception that the Kenyan government has exercised what we call collective punishment of that region. So that region, you look at any indicators, of development, of human development, they rank the lowest. Whether you're talking Garissa, Wajir, or any of those areas in Eastern Kenya. Now, perhaps one should then explain the linkages between ethnic Somalis and Muslims. Ethnic Somalis in Kenya make up 54%, more than half of Muslims in Kenya. And that's why there's always these linkages then between ethnic Somalis and Muslims and of course Al-Shabaab. And then of course the obvious linkages in terms of demographics, that ethnic Somalis that are citizens of Kenya, of course they are core ethnics are ethnic Somalis in Somalia. So what happens in Somalia has an impact in Eastern Somalia, where ethnic Somalis then stay. Now, in terms of this constricted democratic space, this has always been the grievance of ethnic Somalis and Muslims, that the Kenyan government restricts their participation in politics, restricts their participation in the economy in terms of access to economic resources, and they see this as a deliberate government policy to marginalize them, to punish them, particularly because they wanted to break away from the state since 1963. And it's not only them in the north, it is also in the coast. So the Mombasa Republican Council, for example, is an organization that has not been demonstrated to engage in terrorism, but it is fighting for the same rights of Muslims, and that's why they are also agitating for independence. So it's not only Al-Shabaab that wants the independence of Eastern Kenya or the coast. It is also other formations, including the Republican Council, but they engage in different politics. Al-Shabaab chooses to engage in violent politics, whereas they engage in persuasion politics or pressure politics. But it is the same grievances of ethnic Somalis and Muslims that they are fighting about. To say the Kenyan democratic space is very constricted and it is very limited and does not want to hear their grievances. And this has been going on since independence. And then, of course, Al-Shabaab is just latching on those grievances since 2006.
Thank you, Benjamin. We're going to give the last question now, and any of the panel members can respond to this. It says here, the stability of the state is achieved through the strengthening of the army, the police, and the independence of the judicial authorities. Have special strategies been adopted to strengthen the independence of judicial institutions in African countries?
Well, let me just say this. I did write a response, and one of the problems is that much of the resources to fight counterterrorism was put into the military and far less into governance and development. And if you look at reports coming out of the United Nations Development Program and so on, governance, as well as the Global Terrorism Index, by the way, governance is one of the key challenges driving terrorism or etc. So I think that, there's this popular phrase, the whole of government approach and so on. I think obviously violent terrorists have to be confronted militarily, but you also have to give people hope. You have to give people a say in, and it alludes to what Benjamin just said now, there are real grievances amongst populations, and the key strategy must be to alleviate those local grievances before they link up with your international terror networks, be it in the form of Al-Qaeda or Islamic State. I'll just hand over to Sergey for the last word, maybe.
I think your mic is off, sir.
I'm sorry, there's actually, thank you, Hussein. There's a question about excessive force of African governments. Have we answered that in chat? No? Because I could give just a few
Sorry. No, I had
this is yours.
I had answered.
You have answered that. Okay. I don't see it, but maybe I so to wrap up, okay, so I think that it has been very valuable discussion, and actually there are some ideas that we could use in future research, I think, for us, some various aspects that we haven't really covered, and that is extremely interesting for us to have this interaction, and we thank very much the hosts for this discussion, for your valuable and interesting questions. I think that you are really very have much insight in this field, and like I said in the beginning, that I have very much respect for your journal. So thank you very much for this event. Thank you, and for all participants as well. Thank you again.
Thank you, and from our side, thank you for all the questions and comments and feedback from our panel members. I think from a security studies perspective, this is a really valuable book for students, practitioners, and scholars. So thanks a lot for the discussion and the debate today. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Reutner to do the welcoming, or to do the appreciation and thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. I just want to thank the panel members for their discussion and participation here. Dr. Kostelyanets, thank you very much, and I appreciate your background there, because I could see my country's name reflecting there just over your shoulder. So it's an intentional plant. Thank you. And then Professor Solomon, thank you very much, and Dr. Mokoena, thank you for sharing your perspectives on the book. And then soon to be Dr. Eva Jordan. Thank you very much, my colleague, for moderating the session. Ms. Anne Delport for running the online platform and discussions. Mr. Yannick Smit for the technical support. And then Professor Eva Kleindans, the editor of Sciente Malikaria, for all his support in the background. We thank you all. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you
so much. Thank you.